Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 261, Canaan, Unconquered. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we continue our series on the Bible as it was, and on the Bible as it is. Last week we called our episode The Bible, It's Alive, about the way that the Bible has a afterlife after it's written. It still continues to live and continues to have influences over the last 2,000 plus years. I think all of us know this deep down, and yet it's really interesting and important to be able to drill down into a particular story and see its continuing influences. Today we'll focus mostly on the book of Joshua, a less widely read, perhaps a less well-known book, at least here in America, but one that has had a lot of impact in Israel. Our guest today, Rachel Havrelock, has just come out with a book on this subject called The Joshua Generation, Israeli Occupation and the Bible. Rachel Havrelock is an associate professor of English and Jewish studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where she directs the UIC Freshwater Lab, which generates research and policy on transboundary water systems and climate change adaptation, trains a new generation of water leaders, and creates public-facing media like the Freshwater Stories and Backward River digital platforms. That work on water is connected to Rachel Havrelock's earlier book called River Jordan, The Mythology of a Dividing Line. So you can see how her research on the Bible is very much connected to live issues in our world today. Rachel Havrelock is the co-author of Women on the Biblical Road, Ruth, Naomi, and the Female Journey. And she is the writer and director of a hip-hop play called From Tel Aviv to Ramallah about the daily lives of young people in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She was also the co-host of the Discovery Channel series on the historical Jesus called Who Was Jesus? We are really excited to get into this conversation about the Bible and its continuing influences on politics in the world today. So Rachel Havrelock, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Great to be here.
So we're really excited to talk to you because as compared to a lot of the folks that we've talked to in this series and that we've talked to in general on Judaism Unbound, I feel like your scholarship combines the biblical times and, the sources and figuring out what was really happening back then, but also its application and its use in more contemporary times. And I want to go deep into that, but I want to start with your recent work on Joshua. And could you talk a little bit about those connections, the interplay between the story of the book of Joshua, which a lot of folks might not even know much about, so a little bit of background there, and how, in particular, in Israel in the last decades, that story has been used in political ways?
So I spent about 10 years of my life immersed in this book, and by the accounts of most modern sensibilities, this is the worst book that the Bible has on offer. Right, celebrates genocide, is thrilled about conquest, about ethnic cleansing, about expropriation of property, and puts this under a banner of an ancient version of holy war. So, by all accounts, this is really, really a rough book. And part of what's interesting in the history of the book of Joshua, of course, it is in the Hebrew Bible, but for most of the history, thousands of years of history of Jewish interpretation, Jews barely read it. Because of the many diasporic settings in which Jews found themselves, they really turned away from it. So if you're following a synagogue cycle of reading, you're not going to hear a lot of Joshua. And that was by design of the rabbis saying, look, we are guests in various countries of the world. So celebrating militarism, ethnic cleansing, holy war, it's not our ethic, but it's also not politically wise. So Joshua was downplayed in the history of Jewish interpretation, and Moses, right, the lawgiver, the prophet, became the icon. The reason that the book of Joshua assumed prominence in modern Jewish thought dates back to a study group, a biblical study group held in the home of Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, during which Israel's founding fathers, as it were, in the military, in the courts, in the ministries, in the universities, and in the military, sat for about a year and a half, twice a month in Ben-Gurion's dining room, and they pored over the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua and its Israeli interpretation ended up becoming the framework for the public narrative of Israel's founding that was celebrated at the State of Israel's 10th birthday. And it was a time when a mostly immigrant populace was presented with a package. This is our national story. And the book of Joshua, right, this strange and very unsettling ancient book, became the framework for that Israeli public narrative.
One of the ways that I understand the current research in the area, the current archaeology, for example, is that it quite definitively demonstrates that the story of the book of Joshua is incorrect. So basically, just to explain that the story of the book of Joshua happens right after the wandering in the wilderness. It's the story of what happens right after the Israelites come into the land of Israel. And as you were saying, like, bottom line, they go around and kill everybody and, take over their cities. And because God said that they should, that God allowed them to. And archaeology, as I understand it, has found no evidence at all of some kind of mass warlike activity where all the cities were sacked around the same time, and it just suggests that never happened. So I've thought of the book of Joshua as something like Quentin Tarantino's movie Django Unchained, where it's kind of a fantasy, a revenge fantasy against the people who oppress us, written specifically by a people who never actually did that. And the danger is that sometime much, much later, you get into a situation where you actually do have the power and you read this story as if it were actually a true story. And you say, oh, yeah, this is what we should do. And now for the first time in history, you can do it.
Yeah, your account of it is really compelling, but I want to complicate it a little bit. I agree with you that the archaeology I read points to a very different scenario in the ancient world than one of ethnic cleansing, constant war, and genocide. However, as much as biblical scholars want to look to archaeology and just kind of give us the material record, give us what's historically true, archaeology itself is bound by processes of interpretation. What I'm doing with the book of Joshua, although I also have concluded that there was no holy war in which all of the Canaanites were exterminated and disappeared off the face of the earth, but I reached that by actually contending with the text itself. Because the book of Joshua, and there's scholarly consensus on this, basically is bifurcated. And in the first 12 chapters of the book of Joshua, you get all the high plot events of a perfect army marching in lockstep behind Joshua and realizing this dream of complete settlement and territorial control. But if you go to the second half of the book of Joshua, the second 12 chapters, all of the very peoples said to have been exterminated are all still there. So you don't have to go to archaeology. You just have to go to the second half of the book. And so suddenly this picture of an ancient nation defined by its army completely dissolves.
This is wildly relevant to our own times. I mean, I will stand behind the claim that all of our episodes in this unit looking at Bible are wildly relevant to our time. But like this book of Joshua, and as you're articulating the different narratives that different people can draw from Joshua, and even from the archaeological evidence, like all of that has huge stakes in terms of, Israeli national claims and Palestinian national claims and all sorts of things. And so I wanna sort of unpack that, because what you just were talking about in terms of, there's a second half of this book of Joshua, and it's not just the Israelites there. There's others still around. It matters for people who would point to the book of Joshua or point to the Bible generally as like, this is a claim that says this land between Jordan and Mediterranean, say, is sort of a Jewish land, because we have this text that says a bunch of precursors to the Jews, the Israelites, went in and it's theirs now. And so, done deal. It's a Jewish, like if somebody were trying to make that claim, they have to wrestle with, in that very text you're talking about, there's actually a whole bunch of people still there who are not themselves part of the group. So what's up? So I'd ask you, what's up there? What is happening in the second half of that book, and how does it tie to the kinds of debates people have now?
So in the second half of the book of Joshua, the picture from the first half starts to unravel. Whereas in the first half of the book of Joshua, the nation is almost entirely defined through its army, and thus is depicted as being almost entirely male. And there's a level of discipline, of violence, of territorial hunger that's very unsettling. But you open up to the second half, and the first thing that crosses your mind is, wait a second, who are all these Canaanite neighbors? What is this dividing Jerusalem between Benjaminites and Judites and Jebusites? And so the picture that emerges, from the second half of the book of Joshua undoes the first. We see that there is no nation, and that you've got a kind of a decentralized, diffuse group of tribes, of clans, of households. And they are living, right, in place, really defined by landscape, by forest, by the availability of water. And they are alongside neighbors that are also dispersed along these structures of tribe and clan and household. What we see in the second half of the book of Joshua, and when we read that together with archaeological records and anthropological studies of the ancient world, we see that there were these different regional arrangements, right? And that people had nested identities according to their family and household, their clan, and their tribe. But my dating, right, is around the 9th, 8th century before the Common Era. You have empires on the rise, like Assyria and like Egypt. And so there we have in Canaan this like diffuse, decentralized order with all these different peoples. And like the army of Assyria is going to be marching through. And so the rise of those empires catalyzed a kind of a centralization, a series of alliances among groups, so that when an empire's army came through, you could muster more than a tiny regional militia. So that process of consolidating groups, of pulling people in, I argue is what gave rise to the book of Joshua, such that every tribe or family that joined in this confederation of Israel, they became counted in the army, right? So if you're the tribe of Reuben, you're like, look, we live east of the Jordan, but we sure don't want to lose everything. We'll have an alliance with you. So they come and consolidate, right, under this umbrella of Israel. And they get organized according to a 12-tribe scheme, but they come under that banner of Joshua's army, or the banner of Bnei Israel, the people of Israel. And so what I'm saying is this story of the army that we get in the first half of the book of Joshua that is synthesized by taking all of the eventual allies and absorbing them into this narrative structure of an unbeatable army. The first half of the book of Joshua presents a synthesized story of an army as a way of trying to affect a political military alliance in the present. And the next part of that, which I think I can't say enough and I can't say loudly enough. So what does that mean about the Canaanites, right? What does that mean about the Jebusites? I conclude that, being Israelite or Judite or Jebusite or Canaanite, these are not ancient ethnic differences. These are differences among groups of people that joined an alliance called Israel and those who did not do so. So I think, the only difference between someone from the tribe of Judah and someone who gets labeled a Jebusite is that the tribe of Judah joined the alliance and the Jebusites didn't, and the Canaanites didn't. And so the kind of fury, the kind of like genocidal fury that we read about in the book of Joshua doesn't reflect like some kind of eternal ethnic rivalry. It's a political rivalry. It's what you say about your political opponents who do not join your alliance and therefore appear very different from you.
In hearing you talk about that, Rachel, I'm thinking of 1984 and the whole idea of we were always at war with Eurasia or we were always at war with East Asia. It's like, which, for those who haven't read the book, it's that moment where like the alliances shift and you pretend that all along you were at war with somebody that you actually had just been aligned with. And it's like, what you're saying is, all these tribes were always at war with East Asia. To take the analogy too far, but basically like, oh, surprise, everybody who's currently on our team as we write this book, we're going to tell the story that they were always on our team for eternity. And not only that, like their parents were all family, their ancestors were all family and like literally tied genetically. Like that's how I'm understanding your argument, which is like, you can feel the like shots fired intensity of that you would go so far as being like, your great grandparents are worse than mine and less sacred and tied to a less interesting story. And also you can totally get it, right? Like it makes sense as a political play to be like, yeah, this like, it's not just that they're, currently not our friends. It's like there is something about them. We're going to tell this story that shows that they are just unequivocally for a long time not part of the team. So I'm really interested in that. Because of that, I'm kind of interested in talking about the person, Joshua. He's the title character of this book, and he himself, from my understanding of scholarly work on biblical criticism or otherwise, he himself has a story, like an origin story that some people think is kind of a retrojection, where like after the fact, he's put into the Torah in a way that he may not have always been there. And what I'm referring to is specifically, his glory story is that he's one of the two folks in the 12 spies story that goes into the promised land and says, this is great. All the other 10 folks are like, this land is terrible. Joshua and Caleb are on the good side that God likes, and because it's the land that they're supposed to go to, whatever. Am I right in my understanding of that? How do scholars look at that person, Joshua, and to what extent should we learn more about him in talking about the book that's named after him?
Joshua indeed has a book named after him, but is one of the flatter and more hollow biblical characters. I mean, for readers who go in sequence, so, read Deuteronomy, in which Moses, in very tragic psychological terms, wrestles with his impending death and, even with the existential reality of death itself. So we're kind of going through it with Moses's psyche. And when we kind of turn out of the Pentateuch, out of the 5 books of Moses, and we open the book of Joshua, we have an entirely flat character. Joshua is really characterized by his obedience and, interestingly enough, has no title. Right? Once called the servant of God, but is not labeled a prophet. is not labeled a judge, is not labeled a king. I mean, we get that he's a general because he leads these battles, but he doesn't even have a title. Biblical literature does have great literature and does have complex characters. Joshua's not one of them. And you can't really do a lot of psychological depth with an icon, and Joshua, right, becomes an icon of this army and of this ancient nation, right? So really kind of like a trope of what I would call ancient nationalism. Now, I believe that the book of Joshua is ultimately synthesized by a group of editors that we call the Deuteronomists. So they're also very smart editors. So Joshua ends up becoming a kind of a tool that the Deuteronomic editors, really use to kind of weave eras together and also to contain a kind of a perfect model. Right? They want a leader, is in their language, who neither veers to the left nor the right, right? Who keeps Torah, kind of on the cuff at all times. And so they give Joshua authority by putting him back in the times of Moses, right? Someone who experienced the whole Exodus, and even while being a member of this desert generation, right? The generation of the liberated slaves, Joshua and his spy buddy Caleb, right, are portrayed as the only two who believe in going to war in this land. So I think that's right. I think the Deuteronomists create Joshua to be an icon of the kind of unity to which they aspire. And one more piece that I'll add to your question about Joshua and Caleb, who again are depicted as these faithful spies who go against the will of their generation. I love it kind of that the liberated slaves don't want to go to war. I feel like we haven't done enough to really like reclaim that biblical anti-war position expressed by that generation. But, Joshua, like I said, he's a Deuteronomic creation, but there's a lot of northern stuff going on with Joshua. And Caleb is a southern figure. Just as these editors could really say we've always been at war with the Canaanites, their system could also absorb later alliances. So Caleb, who is this southern figure, is a Kenizi. He's a Kenizzite. And the Kenizzites are ultimately a group that gets absorbed under the tribe of Judah. The 12-tribe structure is very good at pointing to those people who are on the outside, who don't join the alliance, and saying those Edomites, those Canaanites, those Jebusites, they're our enemies. But it's also good at absorbing groups that might join the alliance at their own pace, and then saying, oh, well, that's Caleb. He's the head of the Kenizzite clan, and that's a subfamily of Judah. So both things are possible for trying to account for political alliances.
Can we situate some of what you're talking about in some sense of historical time to understand sort of when the actual events that are being responded to are happening versus the time where the story is set? What's going on geopolitically in the time of the Israelites when they are making all these alliances? And then, if I understand the approximate time frame here, they're basically writing and rewriting these stories that are functionally taking place around 500 years earlier, right? I mean, so it almost becomes like they're writing and rewriting and massaging this almost like mythic prehistory. It's not just like they're telling a story from 50 years ago differently. They're telling a story from 500 years ago differently. I'm just curious if you could give us some sense of what was actually going on in their world at that time that was motivating them to do all this.
So, yes, speaking about timeline, this is the kind of thing that Bible scholars go to conferences to fight about. So let me kind of break down this picture together with a timeline. Let me start somewhere, which is a very important piece of poetry And it's important because of how it serves as a historical index. And that's the Song of Deborah. And the Song of Deborah, which we believe, based on its grammar and syntax, is one of the oldest texts in the Bible. And some people even speak about the year 1200 BCE. In that, Deborah sings about a war, and she sings that some tribes came and fought in the war and some sat home. So she disparages the tribes who sat home, and she sings the praises of the tribes who came. That's very important to me because it shows that the success or failure of a given tribe in war depended upon who their allies were. So we see major motivation for these processes of consolidation. Many scholars have shown how in the 9th, 8th century BCE, you've got these processes of consolidating clans and tribes into something that looks like a proto-nation. This is happening in the region, and it's about war. Because if you're a national formation, right, if you're a bunch of tribes and you've got a consolidated federation of peoples, you're going to lose. But then we get, 8th century BCE, the rise of empires, in particular Assyria, and the threat of Assyria marching, or the Egyptian empire having its second wind around this time. It's that process that I think gets people thinking, we've got to come up, with a larger scale organization and army. And so Joshua gives this army, which is kind of being configured in real time, it gives this army a kind of heroic prehistory behind which people can march. And so it means, that it works and doesn't work because the Assyrian army takes out the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, in 722, but ends up sparing the kingdom of Judah. So I'm putting, this push to consolidation as prior to Assyria. But there is an argument that these traditions from the north came into the biblical canon when northerners streamed in as refugees. Now, I would love to be wrong about this, but I have not seen the narratives of refugees make it into the national annals. So I don't think you go collecting the traditions and stories of refugees. I think you do that when there's a real bargain, where you've got a tribe and they're like, you want us in the alliance? Well, wait a second. We've got a hero named Joseph. We've got land traditions. We want these things included. So I think what the Deuteronomists do when they gather all this stuff together, right, they're gathering up traditions that did date back hundreds and thousands of years that were passed on orally.
Whoa. Okay. So I am taking a lot of that in, and I really want to hone in on what I read as maybe a takeaway from what you just said, which is, in certain senses, the very foundation of our Torah, of like the set of teachings and stories that have been woven together by, whether it's by the Deuteronomists or by others, like the very foundations of what determined the content of those stories and, the family makeup of the Genesis stories and all, like the very foundation is fear and war and nationalism. Maybe I'm overstating it, but like what I hear you suggesting is like basically the seed of how we tell these stories is that a bunch of different groups were negotiating out, how are we going to tell our collective stories in order to fight wars together? And if that's the case, or even if it's potentially the case, maybe that's sort of the safer level of certainty to assert this with. Like, if it's potentially the case, it feels incumbent on anybody relating to those stories as a sacred text, which is to say the Torah and, Joshua and later biblical texts to some extent too, like it feels incumbent upon us to really wrestle with questions of war and nationalism and conquest. And I don't think that that's primarily what most of us are doing when we're engaging with these stories. By the way, I'm not saying, we should all self-flagellate and say we're like doing terrible things by not talking about that. But like, it feels like a big point that you're making, which is, if that is the origin story to some extent, that, we tell these stories based on a set of negotiations between different groups to forge alliances in war. I want us as a Jewish population, peoplehood, civilization, whatever the right noun is, I want us to say, that gives us some responsibilities to really think about what that would mean for us now and how we relate to power and nationalism and all that. Am I overstating, or is there something here?
Yeah. Okay. So, let's just take a minute with some broad terms. You open any epic, be it Canaanite or Greek, and they're all about wars, right? What's the Odyssey, right? He's escaped from war. Again, we want to emplace these processes that I'm describing in their context. And, ancient stories, it's like fear about fertility and reproduction and a lot of war. So that is the landscape. And right, I am saying, we can call the motivation for these series of negotiations and alliances, we can call it fear and war, or we could call that same thing the thrust for survival, right? All alliances do arise, out of some kind of wager of how are you going to survive? How are you going to be able to transmit something? How are you going to be able to reproduce? So grasping this paradigm that alliances are flexible and necessary, and they can be durable, but they change over time. I actually think in contemporary terms, that brings us to a better position than hearing as I did in a presentation to the UN Security Council by Israel's ambassador to the UN, that there is an eternal ethnicity of Jews, and that this eternal ethnicity of Jews is represented by Abraham in the book of Genesis, who's given a promise to land, and that the promise of land given to Abraham entitles the state of Israel, right, to full sovereignty over the lives of occupied Palestinians. That premise, which is more widespread, to me is more terrifying, because we're like, look, these were tribes, and some of them were in more fertile areas, some of them were richer, some of them were poorer and confronting drought, but they figured out a way to come together, and they were really politically angry with their neighbors that didn't join them. And so they wished all kinds of, extermination and disappearance on them. But, in the same book of Joshua, where they have, where they really imagine in verbal terms getting rid of them, they also admit they're all still there. So, in a way, rather than wrestling with the way in which this is rooted in war, ancient culture, it's rooted in war.
I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about some of the material that I think is really also in your other book, River Jordan. And I'm thinking in particular about the Moabites and the Ammonites, but which are these two tribes that are on the other side of the Jordan, in the land that we call Jordan today. And the Bible has particular disdain for them. It's interesting that the Bible, particularly the Torah, talks about the lands of Mesopotamia, Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, those kind of areas, in kind of these sort of nice terms, in the sense that, hey, we're from there, actually. Abraham, he came from there. And those were the big, scary superpowers. Whereas the little neighbor Moab, who, what are they really going to do to us? they're the most hated. They could never become a Jew. They could never join our community. And then we know, of course, that at other times in Jewish history, that kind of waxes and wanes. And so there's the story right in the book of Ruth. Ruth is from Moab, and she somehow becomes the grandmother of King David. And then I was actually thinking in the Talmud, there's this other famous story where the sort of head of the Yavne yeshiva is kicked out, and they come in and they solve all the problems. And the first problem that they solve is that there's this Moabite guy who wants to become a Jew. And they were telling him that he can't become a Jew because the Torah explicitly says that you can't become a Jew. But then they find all these ways and they say, okay, he can become a Jew. And it strikes me that around the time that they're talking about, after the destruction of the temple, maybe we should put aside these arguments with the Moabites because we have got bigger problems going on here. And so that actually is an interesting paradigmatic story about how just in those kind of relationships. So I'm just curious about if you could talk a little bit about the various relationships that there were. And then I would love if you talk a little bit about Israel and the Palestinians, or the Jews and the Christians today, or Republicans and Democrats. I mean, what can we learn from this that actually gets us thinking in new ways about the relationships that we have today?
So it's absolutely right that despite the fact that Babylonia and Persia and Egypt at different times were the conquering empires that really brought any form of Israelite or Judite or Judean sovereignty to a close, but those are the empires, and that's where the academies are, where likely these scribes had some period of training. So the fact that there is a kind of an aspirational relationship and even created narrative connection to these places, it's sort of, not surprising. It's almost, our Canaanite scribes giving them some Ivy League imprimatur kind of thing. But the local fights and the local alliances, right? I mean, the hardest thing to negotiate is something like, how are you going to distribute water among groups who might farm or do, olive oil or shepherd? So back to the book of Joshua, the second half is kind of full of this stuff. It is not easy to live with and alongside people. Anyone who's ever been in a condo association or a communal household, right, in college or otherwise, knows of what I speak. And so you're going to have a lot of skirmish and a lot of conflict and a lot of trash to talk about your immediate neighbors. But I think that the kind of tension and difficulty that we can see in the second half of the book of Joshua, of how do you live in the same place with people, and how do you distribute resources, and how do you figure it out, and how do you plan for a future, I think that is very relevant. The Joshua generation, the subtitle is Israeli Occupation and the Bible. And there was a decision made by David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, and his cohort of elites. There was a decision made to elevate the book of Joshua. Ben-Gurion and the founders of the state of Israel were looking for a paradigm. How do you have a national army? What do you call it? What do you call these places to which you have arrived, in your ancient homeland? Where do the borders go? Who are we? So the book of Joshua became newly relevant to the state of Israel, to the point where it didn't only become a relevant book, it really became one of the most relevant books. And it means that militarism, an outsized valuing of certain paradigms of masculinity, dichotomy, and enmity against indigenous residents, all came with it. The book of Joshua kind of imported it all. And, Ben-Gurion kind of fancied himself a modern day avatar of Joshua. And that meant that subsequent generations kind of tried to out Joshua, the first Joshua. So, Moshe Dayan, who conquered the West Bank in the 1967 war, he declared that Ben-Gurion was like Moses, but Dayan himself was Joshua. Following the 1967 war, and in particular in the 1980s, leaders of the settler movement again took up the mantle of Joshua and said, well, these people like Ben-Gurion, they left it undone. We've got to go right into, the newly conquered land. And so again, the book of Joshua became elevated all the more in the settler movement. So is it time to keep on upping the ante with who can be more Joshua-like, who can be more militaristic? Or is it time to move to that second half of the book and say what you have between the Jordan and the sea? You've got different peoples defined by ethnicity, by religion or levels of religious observance, by class, by region. And isn't it time to come up with a system and just look at the number of people who are there and think about what will it take for all the people there? And so maybe it is time, if the Bible does have so much authority and relevance to the modern state of Israel, I'd like to put that call out to move on to the second half of the book of Joshua and just admit, right, you're inhabiting a patchwork land with a lot of different peoples and work out some kind of model of survival.
Wow. As a last piece, I want to bring in what you've alluded to a few times, and especially what you just alluded to around from river to sea. And you've talked about water at a few different moments in passing phrases. And I know you've done a lot more than passing phrases on that question of water in Bible and even water today. I every once in a while have this mental meandering where I think about myself and I'm like, I grew up in Wisconsin, which is a funny place because Wisconsin is between a river and a sea, but not quite a sea. It's between a river and a lake. It's between the Mississippi River on the west and Lake Michigan on the east. I lived on a street called Lake Drive, literally on the lake. Like east from my house was a lake. And I now live in Rhode Island, where east of my house by a few blocks is technically a bay, but eventually ocean. And I lived in Mississippi for 2 years. These are the three places I've ever lived. And I didn't actually live that close to the Mississippi River, but to my west was the Mississippi River. My entire life, I have lived on land that defines itself and is boundaried, defines its boundaries around where water is. All that's to say, I would hate to leave this episode without hearing a little more from you directly on questions of water, because I think it's very easy and probably way more common than not for people to read through Bible and, okay, so there's the thing, Moses and the rock, and then there's water, and there's the thing, we cross this river to go into, you notice the water, it's not invisible, we parted a sea, but it's a sea. It could have been any number of things. They could have left in any number of ways, and the story could have culminated with any number of things. But the thing that happens is a sea parts. Why a sea? What do we do with water in Bible? How should we be thinking about it? And my suspicion is this: your answer to this is a lot. But to what extent does it tie to these questions of politics that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I did not know at the beginning of my career as a biblical scholar that my life would become so conjoined with questions of water. When I started writing my book, River Jordan, it was really a question of to what degree did boundaries in the Bible influence the modern nation states of Israel and Jordan and Palestine. I was kind of wondering, the Bible and boundaries, what's going on? So it really started out as a border project. So that led me to also about a 10-year long folklore research where I went around in Jordan, in Israel, in Palestine, and I collected people's Jordan crossing stories. But over those 10 years, I spent a lot of time by the Jordan River, and I watched it shrinking before my eyes. And I thought, you can't go and write a whole book about a river and not ever pay attention to its geophysical and environmental characteristics. So right towards the end of my research, I started looking into different water groups who were very active. And I end the book with some of their plans and visions and assessments of the health of the Jordan River. And I became acquainted with an environmental peace building group, EcoPeace Middle East. Over the years, I got involved with EcoPeace Middle East and also learned from them about this approach of environmental peace building. I find it very powerful because the idea is that we can define ourselves, of course, by our religion or by our citizenship, by our city or town, the place we live. These are all intersectional and important ways of self-definition. But when it comes down to our physical survival and well-being, that really depends on where we are drawing our water. And so environmental peace building involves bringing people from different communities who feel themselves in a relationship of conflict or are in a situation of conflict to assess their shared water source. What pollutes it? What imperils it? Who receives the most? Who receives the least amount? And so the work with EcoPeace influenced sort of what I do when I'm in the Middle East. I also have been working in the past years and kind of adapting some of this environmental peace building right here around our own North American Great Lakes, where it's
Lake Michigan's the greatest lake, by the way, just to tell all the listeners
I'll
out
be
there.
with you. Yeah. I mean, I'm originally from Detroit, so I would have had a little Lake Huron with you, but I've been in Chicago long enough. Yeah, it is the greatest lake. But now here we are, right? Speaking of the North American Great Lakes, over a fifth of the world's fresh water. We've got terrible legacies of segregation and racial discrimination. Now, we've got militias and all kinds of right-left splits right here. So, to bring this back to our conversation, there are models for this in the Bible. I kind of try to emulate a figure in the book of Joshua who is Asa, the son of Caleb. And it's an amazing story because the wars finish up in Joshua chapter 12, and we open Joshua chapter 13, and we get to hear a woman speak. And she speaks with her father about how is she going to survive in the place he assigns her to live. And she ultimately opens up a water negotiation with her father. The power of negotiation over water allows people to be invested in where they live in non-national terms, right? Nations might have jurisdiction over water and might like to hand it out to corporations and all the like. But when we think about ourselves as residents of a watershed and our relationship to our neighbors, that's different from a kind of an ethno-national or racial or class terms. And I think that it was quite understood by our biblical writers and editors because we have so many stories, both about the problems of sharing water and the victories when it's done well.
So I'm going to break a rule that I don't know if I've ever broken on the podcast, but I'm going to give away when we recorded this. We recorded this the day after Tu B'Shvat, which is a big day where you celebrate trees. And I spent some of the last couple of days meditating on that. I love that you gave us this opportunity to build into that or add on to that water. So this episode is coming out much later, but, breaking the rule for that. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really, really fun, and I am honored to be a part of this conversation.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you will continue along with us through this unit of conversations on the Bible. We're having a lot of fun with it so far. It's going to keep being fun. We want to close out this conversation in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our Twitter or our Instagram. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way. And you can do that with either a monthly recurring gift or just a one-time donation at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.